I now give the floor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, to brief the Assembly on his priorities for 2025.
President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by wishing you and your families a very happy and healthy 2025. Excellencies, let's start with the good news. It is understandable to get overwhelmed by the turmoil of our world. But as we look to the year ahead, we must never lose sight of progress and potential. And there are signs of hope. Negotiators are in the final stages of a ceasefire and hostage release deal in Gaza. Meanwhile, the ceasefire in Lebanon is largely holding, and the country was finally able to elect a president after over 2 years of stalemate. On the climate front, the world now invests almost twice as much in clean energy as it does in fossil fuels. And almost everywhere, solar and wind are now the cheapest sources of new electricity and the fastest growing in history. In much of the world, girls have achieved parity in education, and more children are surviving today than ever before. HIV infections continue to dramatically decline along with malaria mortality rates. And we have seen meaningful new steps to reduce child marriage, protect our oceans, and expand internet access. And we begin 2025 lifted by the commitments of the Pact for the Future, the Global Digital Compact, and the Declaration on Future Generations. And these measures are an affirmation of the power and purpose of our United Nations in our 80th anniversary year. Through thick and thin, the world has come together through the United Nations to tackle some of the most intractable problems, easing tensions, forging and keeping peace, settling bold goals to fight poverty, hunger, inequality, and climate change, seeking accountability for violations of international law, including international human rights law, delivering life-saving aid in the most desperate places on earth. From day one, the United Nations has represented the global conscience. In a world seemingly hell-bent on destruction, our organization has been a force of construction. And every day, we continue to strengthen how we work and deliver. From bolstering the UN development system on the ground to achieving gender parity at the highest levels, we remain restless for reform, striving to be more effective and cost-effective, simplifying procedures and decentralizing decisions, enhancing transparency and accountability, and shifting resources to invest in data, digital, innovation, strategic foresight, and behavioral science through our UN 2.0 initiative. The United Nations reflects a key truth. Global problems demand global solutions. The more the UN does together to address big challenges around the world, the less the burden on individual countries to do it alone. Excellencies, this spirit of hope, rooted in action, must propel us forward. Yes, there is progress in our tumultuous world. But let's have no illusions. This is very much a world in turmoil and grave uncertainty. Our actions or inactions have unleashed a modern-day Pandora's box of ills. 4 of those ills stand out because they represent at best threats that could disrupt every aspect of our agenda and at worst upend our very existence. Runaway conflicts, rampant inequalities, the raging climate crisis, and out-of-control technology. The good news is that we have the plans to tackle these challenges. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, we need to get the wheel moving. Through acceleration and transformation, and oriented around the Pact for the Future, the implementation of which will be a central priority in 2025. Excellencies, let's start with peace. Conflicts are multiplying, become messier and deadlier. Deepening geopolitical divisions and mistrust are adding fuel to the fire, and the nuclear threat is at its highest in decades. The spectrum of human rights is under constant attack, and impunity is endemic, with serial violations of international law, international humanitarian law and UN Charter, and systematic assaults on our very institutions. In Gaza, we have been relentlessly calling for an immediate ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages, and the immediate action to protect civilians and ensure the delivery of life-saving aid. I want to once again salute the backbone of the humanitarian response, our colleagues in UNRWA. Of course, nothing can justify the terror attacks by Hamas on October 7th, and nothing can justify the dramatic levels of death and destruction inflicted on the Palestinian people. For months, there has been no ceiling to the suffering and no bottom to the horrors. I strongly appeal to all parties to finalize a ceasefire and hostage release deal sooner rather than later. Excellencies, across the region we are seeing a reshaping of the Middle East. What is far less clear is what will emerge. In Israel and Palestine, will we see irreversible action toward the two-state solution in line with UN resolutions, international law, and previous agreements, as we have constantly advocated? Or will we instead see steady annexation by Israel and the denial of the Palestinian people's rights and dignity and the destruction of any chance of sustainable peace? In Syria, after years of bloodshed, will we see a country that can finally be a beacon of different faiths, traditions, and communities, shaping an inclusive, free, and peaceful future as we continue to do everything to support? Or will we see fragmentation along with the trampling of rights of minorities and women and girls? In Iran, will we see concrete actions to ensure clear renunciation of any nuclear weapons program and contributions to a new regional security framework where the sovereignty of every state is respected, allowing for the full integration of Iran into the global economy? That is what we hope will become possible. Or will we see escalations with unpredictable consequences? Throughout the region, we must deny extremists a veto over a peaceful future. Tonight, I'm leaving for Lebanon on a visit of solidarity with the Lebanese people and our peacekeeping forces. A window has opened for a new era of institutional stability, with a state fully able to protect its citizens and a system that will allow the tremendous potential of the Lebanese people to flourish. We will do everything to help keep that window open wide, a window that will allow both Lebanese and Israelis to live in security. Excellencies, there is a world of pain beyond the Middle East. In Ukraine, the war is on the verge of its 4th year, and we must spare no effort for a just, lasting and comprehensive peace in line with UN Charter, international law and the General Assembly resolutions. In Sudan, the warring parties have triggered widespread bloodshed, the world's largest displacement crisis and famine. And we are engaging all parties to protect civilians, de-escalate the conflict, and find a path to peace. In the Sahel, we are working with partners for a renewed dialogue to strengthen regional cooperation and to address common threats, especially terrorism and violent extremism. In Haiti, armed criminal gangs continue to run rampant, and at the very least, we must ensure that the multinational security support mission receives sustainable and predictable funding, just as we must for the African Union support and stabilization mission in Somalia. From Myanmar to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to Yemen and far beyond, we must keep working for peace. This is the raison d'être of the United Nations. And that includes advancing the Pact for the Future's commitments, prioritizing conflict prevention, mediation, conflict resolution and peace building, continuing to strengthen peacekeeping, the meaningful inclusion of women in political and peace processes, the first multilateral agreement on nuclear disarmament in more than a decade, new strategies to end the use of chemical and biological weapons, vital efforts to prevent an arms race in outer space, and advanced discussions on the use of lethal autonomous weapons, and an updated understanding of the impact of today's arms race on sustainable development. A full program coming from the Pact. Excellences.
Excellencies, inequalities are also spreading from the modern-day Pandora's box. Vast inequalities are an unmistakable signal that something is deeply wrong with our social, economic, political, and financial systems. Inequalities can be beaten if we commit to policies that promote equity rather than clinging to the same failed approaches. We must do so on several fronts. It starts by accelerating action to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. 5 years to 2030, less than 1/5 of the targets are on course, aggravated by a $4 trillion annual financing gap. Acceleration means focusing on high-impact areas like poverty eradication, food security, quality education for all, social protection, universal health coverage, energy access, digitalization, and reducing climate impacts. And we must place a particular focus on the needs of Africa. Finance is essential. The Pact for the Future includes clear support for an SDG stimulus to help close the financing gap. It calls on donors to meet official development assistance commitments and for the private sector to invest in sustainable development. And it advocates strong social protection systems, trade that is open and serves as a ladder for countries to grow and develop, and taxation that delivers fairness and broad-based prosperity. We must also fight inequalities by reforming and modernizing the institutions of global finance to represent today's economy, not that of 1945. Developing countries must be represented fairly in the governance of the very institutions that they depend on. And we must strengthen the global safety net and substantially increase the lending capacity of multilateral development banks, making them bigger and bolder. And we must ensure that concessional finance is deployed where it is most needed, taking into account vulnerability and not only GDP per capita. We will step up our calls for meaningful action to help countries in or near debt distress, so that they have more fiscal space to invest in the SDGs. At the same time, we must strengthen and improve the sovereign debt architecture to enable countries to borrow with confidence, as Agenda 2030 demands. I have appointed an expert group to identify practical steps to break out of the morass and galvanize support for action on debt. Excellencies, we have critical opportunities this year to achieve breakthroughs on the SDGs. From the Conference on Financing for Development, to the World Summit for Social Development, to the G20 Summit under the presidency of South Africa, to COP30 in Brazil, to the UN Ocean Conference, through to Beijing Plus 30. Which leads me to another core way in which we must fight inequalities, by expanding opportunities for women and girls. The Pact for the Future calls on all countries to achieve full gender equality by removing all legal, social and economic barriers, by targeted and accelerated action to end all forms of violence and harassment against women and girls, including sexual and gender-based violence, by accelerating investments to close the gender pay gap, including in the care economy, and by ensuring equal participation and leadership opportunities from the boardroom to the halls of political power to the green and digital economies. And we must fight inequalities by standing with young people everywhere. The Declaration on Future Generations commits to strengthen the participation of young people in decision-making at the national and global levels. We are doing so through our newly established UN Youth Office, which is now fully operational. And the Global Digital Compact calls on nations to champion young innovators, nurture entrepreneurial spirit, and equip the next generation with digital literacy and skills that they need. Inequalities are also fueled by the scourge of discrimination and hate speech. We must work to foster communities of belonging and end the spread of hatred and intolerance, including anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry and discrimination against minority Christian communities. This is even more crucial as guardrails around social media platforms are being dismantled, allowing disinformation and hate speech to run rampant.
The Pandora's box has also let loose the climate crisis that is ravaging and savaging our world. Look no further than the hills of Los Angeles. It has gone from the home of disaster movies to a scene of disaster. Who pays the price for climate destruction around the world? Not the fossil fuel industry, pocketing profits and taxpayer subsidies as their products wreak havoc. Every people suffer with their lives and livelihoods, with higher insurance premiums, volatile energy bills, and higher food prices. And particularly the most vulnerable, who have done the least to unleash this devastation. Before the Paris Agreement, we were on a pathway to over 4 degrees of temperature rise by the end of the century. It is true that we are slowly bending down the curve. But every year since Paris has also been among the hottest ever, and last year was the first to push past 1.5 degrees. At the same time, we have a huge opportunity before us. The renewables revolution is unstoppable, and everyday people will benefit, with lower costs of living and better health, energy security, energy sovereignty, good jobs and millions connected to cheap, accessible power. 10 years on from the Paris Agreement, 90% of the world has now committed to net zero. But we must work much harder. We need to shift our collective efforts into overdrive and deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the math is clear. Global emissions must peak this year and rapidly decline thereafter if we are to have a sliver of hope of limiting long-term global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. This year, every country has pledged to submit new economy-wide national climate action plans, or NDCs, that align with 1.5 degrees. These new plans represent a chance to embrace the opportunities of the clean energy era. They must cover all sectors and all greenhouse gases, and together they must cut emissions 60% by 2035 compared to 2019 levels, with clear reduction targets for fossil fuel production and consumption. And they must show how every country will contribute to the global goals agreed at COP28 on deforestation and the energy transition. The G20 must lead, given the scale of their emissions, and this must be achieved in line with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. We recognize circumstances and capabilities that vary around the globe, but we also recognize that all countries must do more, and so will the United Nations. I'm working closely with COP30 host, President Lula of Brazil, to drive action. And I'm writing to leaders of the largest economies and emitters to encourage them to cooperate and seize this chance. At the same time, the United Nations system is helping nearly 100 developing countries to prepare their new national climate action plans, and we will convene a special event to take stock of the plans of all countries, push for action to keep 1.5 within reach, and deliver climate justice. And I will also invite businesses, financial institutions, cities, regions, and civil society to come with credible 1.5 aligned transition plans in line with our Integrity Matters report. To those in business, finance and beyond, who remain committed to credible climate action despite all the pressures we are seeing, I say, you are on the right side of history. Keep it up. And to governments I say, get behind them. Provide the policy and regulatory certainty businesses need. Address barriers to action. Incentivize the green transition. And accelerate the shift from voluntary pledges to mandatory rules. Excellencies, the battle for 1.5 cannot be won without a fast, fair and funded fossil fuel phase-out worldwide. Today, governments around the world spend 9 times more to make fossil fuels cheaper than they do on making clean energy more affordable for consumers. And barriers, such as high capital costs, are preventing countries from reaping the benefits of the renewables revolution. We must tear down these walls and deliver on climate finance across the board, including through international financial architecture reform. The COP29 agreement on finance must be implemented in full, and the United Nations will help mobilize support for just energy transitions. We'll help drive the implementation of carbon pricing and the wind down of fossil fuel subsidies. And we'll support the leadership of the COP29 and the COP30 presidencies to deliver a credible roadmap to mobilize $1.3 trillion a year, as agreed, needed to support climate action in the developing world. It is time to start implementing new and innovative sources of finance, including old polluters accountable for the damage they have caused. And developed countries must make good on their promise to double adaptation finance to at least $40 billion a year this year. And we must implement the United Nations Early Warnings for All initiative. At the same time, we need a transformation in the world's approach to loss and damage. We must have a major boost to the new fund. let's be clear. To put it in perspective, the amount pledged to date to the Loss and Damage Fund is less than the recent contract signed by one baseball player in New York City. Excellencies, finally, technology is also racing out of the Pandora's box. Of course, the technological revolution offers unprecedented opportunities, but it also demands careful stewardship. We have a historic responsibility to make sure this revolution benefits humanity, not just the privileged few. The Global Digital Compact provides a roadmap for translating aspirations into action, with a particular focus on artificial intelligence. The United Nations must act rapidly and decisively in three ways. First, everyone must have equal access to the latest AI knowledge and insights. The Compact calls for an independent international scientific panel on AI. By pooling expertise across regions and disciplines, this panel would help bridge knowledge gaps and help every nation make the most informed AI policy decisions. The panel has the potential to become the go-to resource, offering clear and impartial analysis of AI capabilities, opportunities, and potential risks. I urge the General Assembly to establish the independent international scientific panel on AI without delay. Second, we must foster AI governance that protects human rights while promoting innovation. The world needs AI that is ethical, safe, and secure. The Compact calls for a global dialogue on AI governance, an inclusive space for stakeholders to come together under the auspices of the UN to develop and coordinate policies, share best practices, and ensure interoperability. This would build on existing global initiatives. Through this dialogue, we can advance international guardrails that uphold human rights, prevent misuse, and encourage responsible innovation. We can tackle emerging challenges, from algorithm bias to data privacy concerns. And we can foster fair access to AI benchmarks and governance tools, ensuring low-income countries their rightful voice in establishing governance standards. I urge the General Assembly to initiate the process for the dialogue to begin this year and continue on a regular basis. And I look forward to working with Spain and Costa Rica as co-facilitators to deliver on these efforts and the Compact's wider vision on AI governance. Third, we must support developing countries in leveraging AI for sustainable development. AI can help reduce poverty, improve health care and education, accelerate scientific discovery and drive sustainable growth. But that requires bridging the global AI divide that is now growing. I will soon present a report on innovative voluntary financing models and capacity building initiatives to help the Global South harness AI for the greater good. To advance all these goals, a new United Nations Office for Digital and Emerging Technologies will support member states, facilitating coordination and action across the UN system and the existing mechanisms. And I thank the General Assembly for establishing the office, and I urge you to resource it fully. Humanity's hand must be firmly in control of technology. As AI reshapes our world, every nation must help shape AI. Together, let's ensure artificial intelligence serves its highest purpose, advancing human progress, equality, and dignity. Excellencies, these are the ills from the modern-day Pandora's box that we must address as a matter of priority. Conflict, inequalities, the climate crisis, and the perils of unchecked technology. But I will conclude with this. There is more to the myth of Pandora than most people know. A close reading of the ancient poem reveals that after the horrors escaped, Pandora noticed one thing left inside the box. As the poet wrote, only hope remained there. There is a lesson in this for our times. We must never lose sight of hope, and we must work to lift the lid on that hope through action to make it real, to help it spread sticking to principles, speaking the truth, never giving up. In our 80th year, let's build a more peaceful, just and prosperous world that we know, despite everything, knowing that it is within reach. Thank you.